The American South in the years leading up to the Civil War was a land steeped in tradition. Honor was paramount, a code by which men lived and died. Southern chivalry, with its roots in a romanticized view of the medieval past, placed a high value on courage, courtesy, and defense of womanhood. This code of honor permeated Southern society, influencing everything from social interactions to political beliefs. For many Southerners, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 represented a direct threat to their way of life. Lincoln's anti-slavery stance ignited fears of Northern aggression and interference in their peculiar institution. The Southern states, feeling increasingly isolated and misunderstood, saw secession as the only way to protect their sovereignty and preserve their traditions. When war finally broke out, Southern men answered the call to arms with a ferocity born of conviction. They were fighting not just for territory or political ideology, but for their homes, their families, and a way of life they held sacred. They viewed the Yankees as invaders, determined to dismantle their traditions and impose their own. This unwavering belief in the righteousness of their cause, fueled by a deep sense of honor and tradition, formed the bedrock of what would become known as the Southern Heart. It was this spirit that sustained the Confederacy through 4 long years of war, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Southern Heart was more than just a catchy phrase, it was the lifeblood of the Confederacy. It embodied the South's unwavering faith in the rightness of its cause, a belief that permeated every level of society. This spirit found its most potent expression in the fierce determination of Southern families, who sent their sons, husbands, and fathers to fight for a cause they held sacred. This unwavering commitment to the Confederacy was evident in the countless acts of sacrifice made by Southern families. Women took on the roles of men, managing farms and businesses while enduring shortages of food and supplies. Children grew up too fast, witnessing the horrors of war firsthand. Yet despite these hardships, the Southern Heart did not waver. The war effort became a family affair, with women sewing uniforms, rolling bandages, and even taking up arms to defend their homes. The Southern home front became an extension of the battlefield, with every sacrifice strengthening the resolve of those on the front lines. However, as the war dragged on and Union victories mounted, the Southern Heart began to manifest in ways that were both heroic and horrifying. Faced with dwindling resources and manpower, the Confederacy increasingly relied on unconventional tactics. This desperation, coupled with the South's deep-seated sense of honor and vengeance, gave rise to a new breed of warrior, the guerrilla. Guerrilla warfare, with its emphasis on surprise attacks, sabotage, and targeting of civilian infrastructure, was a natural outgrowth of the South's desperate situation. Operating outside the traditional rules of engagement, these guerrilla bands, often composed of local men fighting on familiar ground, became a thorn in the side of the Union Army. These bands, often little more than loosely organized militias, were as diverse as the South itself. Some were driven by a burning desire to defend their homes and families, while others were motivated by a more opportunistic sense of adventure or profit. Their tactics, often brutal and unforgiving, reflected the escalating bitterness of the conflict. While these guerrilla groups lacked the discipline and organization of regular army units, their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their willingness to employ terror as a weapon made them a formidable force. They could melt into the civilian population after an attack, making it difficult for the Union to retaliate effectively. The rise of guerrilla warfare marked a turning point in the conflict. It blurred the lines between soldier and civilian, battlefield and home front, and ushered in an era of brutality that would leave an indelible scar on the South. What began as a desperate attempt to defend a way of life would descend into a cycle of violence and retribution, with devastating consequences for both sides. Among the most notorious of these guerrilla leaders was William Clark Quantrill, a man whose name would become synonymous with both Southern daring and barbarity. Born in Ohio, Quantrill's path to infamy began not in the South, but on the Kansas-Missouri border, where he fought in the brutal prelude to the Civil War known as Bleeding Kansas. Quantrill, a former schoolteacher with a brooding intensity, possessed a natural charisma that drew men to his cause. He was a complex figure, capable of both charm and ruthlessness, a skilled tactician driven by a volatile mix of ambition and vengeance. The violence of Bleeding Kansas, with its massacres and reprisals, hardened Quantrill, forging him into a ruthless partisan leader. He saw the conflict in stark terms, a struggle for survival against an enemy he viewed as invaders. This uncompromising worldview, combined with his military acumen, would make him one of the most feared guerrilla leaders of the war. When the Civil War erupted, Quantrill threw his lot in with the Confederacy, raising a band of irregulars that would become known as Quantrill's Raiders. Operating primarily in Missouri and Kansas, Quantrill's men earned a reputation for their daring raids and their brutal tactics. To his supporters, he was a Southern hero, striking back against the enemy. To his detractors, he was a bloodthirsty outlaw, a symbol of the war's descent into savagery. Section 5. Bloody Bill Anderson, Terror on Horseback. If Quantrill represented the calculated brutality of guerrilla warfare, William Bloody Bill Anderson embodied its unhinged fury. A charismatic but unstable figure, Anderson's descent into barbarity was swift and absolute, leaving a trail of blood and terror in its wake. Born in Missouri, Anderson grew up in a family sympathetic to the Southern cause. When the war broke out, he joined a Confederate militia, quickly distinguishing himself for his daring and his ruthlessness. However, it was the death of his father, killed by Union authorities while imprisoned, that seemingly shattered whatever restraint Anderson possessed. Driven by an insatiable thirst for revenge, Anderson formed his own guerrilla band, attracting men of similar temperament. His raids, marked by their ferocity and indiscriminate killing, spread terror throughout Missouri and Kansas. He seemed to revel in the violence, earning his gruesome nickname Bloody Bill through acts of almost unimaginable cruelty. While some Southern sympathizers initially celebrated Anderson's exploits as acts of defiance, his excesses soon alienated even those sympathetic to the Confederate cause. His reign of terror, however brief, left an indelible stain on the history of the conflict, a stark reminder of the dark side of the Southern heart. Section 6. The Knights of the Golden Circle. The descent of the war into guerrilla warfare was not merely a spontaneous eruption of violence, it was, in part, orchestrated by a secret society known as the Knights of the Golden Circle, or KGC. Formed in the years leading up to the war, the KGC initially advocated for the creation of a golden circle, encompassing the southern United States, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, all bound by the institution of slavery. However, as secession became a reality, the KGC shifted its focus to supporting the Confederacy, utilizing its clandestine network for espionage, sabotage, and the recruitment of men willing to wage a more unconventional war. The KGC's rituals, shrouded in secrecy and bound by blood oaths, appealed to those who saw in them a reflection of the South's chivalric ideals, a brotherhood forged in the fires of a righteous struggle. The KGC's influence within the Confederacy was significant, extending to the highest levels of government. Prominent figures within the Confederate government, including Secretary of War Judah P. Benjamin, were rumored to be members or at least sympathetic to the KGC's goals. This access to power, coupled with its secretive nature, made the KGC a potent force in shaping the Confederacy's war effort. As the war turned against the South, the KGC's activities took on a more desperate and ruthless edge. They financed and equipped guerrilla bands, encouraged attacks on northern civilians, and plotted acts of sabotage behind enemy lines. The KGC, initially conceived as a tool for expanding slavery's reach, had become a conduit for the South's most extreme and vengeful impulses. Section 7. A conspiracy unfolds, the Lincoln assassination. As the Confederacy teetered on the brink of collapse, the KGC's most audacious and infamous plot began to take shape: the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. The plan, hatched in the waning days of the war, was a desperate gamble, an attempt to decapitate the Union leadership and sow chaos in the North. The key figure in this conspiracy was John Wilkes Booth, a renowned actor and Confederate sympathizer. Booth, a charismatic but unstable figure, had been involved with the KGC for some time and shared their belief that Lincoln was a tyrant who needed to be eliminated. Booth assembled a motley crew of co-conspirators, including John Surratt, David Harold, Lewis Powell, and George Atzerodt. These men, bound by a shared hatred of Lincoln and fueled by the KGC's ideology of violence, met in secret to finalize their plan. On the night of April 14, 1865, just days after the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, Booth and his co-conspirators carried out their plan. Booth, slipping into Ford's theater, shot Lincoln at point-blank range. Simultaneously, other members of the group were tasked with assassinating Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, though these attempts failed. Lincoln's assassination, while a significant event, did little to alter the course of the war. The Confederacy was already in ruins, its armies shattered. Instead, the assassination served only to deepen the divide between North and South, casting a long shadow over the process of reconciliation. Section 8. The Price of Vengeance. The assassination of Lincoln, while intended to sow chaos and weaken the North, had the opposite effect. The nation, already reeling from 4 years of brutal conflict, reacted with a mixture of grief and outrage. The hunt for Booth and his co-conspirators became a national obsession, a quest for justice and a symbol of the North's determination to bring the perpetrators to heel. The assassination also had a profound impact on the South. Many Southerners, already grappling with the devastating consequences of defeat, were appalled by the assassination. They recognized that this act of violence would only serve to further alienate the North and complicate the already daunting task of rebuilding their shattered region. However, there were also those who saw in Booth a hero, a martyr willing to strike a blow for the lost cause. This romanticized view of Booth and his co-conspirators would persist in some quarters of the South for generations, feeding into the mythology of the Confederacy and hindering efforts at national reconciliation. The assassination of Lincoln, while an extreme example, highlighted the terrible human cost of the war's descent into guerrilla warfare. It demonstrated that violence, once unleashed, could take on a life of its own, spiraling out of control and leaving behind a legacy of pain and division. Section 9. A Legacy of Violence. The American Civil War, even in victory, left an indelible scar on the nation's psyche. The South, its economy in ruins, its social order upended, faced the daunting task of rebuilding. The legacy of slavery, the very issue that had ignited the conflict, continued to cast a long shadow over the nation. The guerrilla war, while a relatively small part of the overall conflict, had an outsized impact. It introduced a level of brutality and terror that was difficult to contain and even harder to forget. The images of burned homes, murdered civilians, and summary executions lingered long after the guns fell silent. The war also left behind a legacy of division and resentment. The South, though defeated, clung to its version of events, romanticizing the Confederacy and minimizing the horrors of slavery. This lost cause mythology, perpetuated through literature, memorials, and public pronouncements, served to hinder the process of national healing. The guerrilla war, with its emphasis on irregular tactics and its blurring of the lines between soldier and civilian, also had a lasting impact on the way wars would be fought in the future. It foreshadowed the rise of total war, where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant would become increasingly blurred. The American Civil War, in all its complexity and tragedy, serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the enduring power of human passions. It teaches us that the pursuit of a just and equitable society is an ongoing struggle, one that demands vigilance, empathy, and a willingness to confront the darker aspects of our shared history.